Thank you. And thank you to my co-presenters up here who have presented some really strong arguments. I am going to present some other arguments, though. Last Wednesday, I gave a talk to a high school group at Frontenac Secondary School, and it was really good. I talked about various definitions that we use in Aboriginal studies to try to define who people are and what those definitions mean. But at the end of the discussion, and I had some good questions from those high school students. At the end of the discussion, the teacher, though, hoping to end on a very positive note, asked the question of me, well, with the change of government, do you think that things are going to get a lot better? And before she could finish, I said no. And I'll tell you why. Let's start with just the business of nation to nation. Canada is a colonial nation. And if you can imagine any chief executive officer dismantling a corporation just because of bad publicity, you can understand what I'm talking about. Canada is not going to deconstruct the colonial mandate that it works under. Not only because it serves the Canadian economy, but because it's allied globally with all of the other colonial nations in this world. And that allyship is a context within Aboriginal people in this country have to negotiate and sort of become mobile in. And that's the reality. And I think we have to be honest with ourselves in terms of that. Even when we look at the beginnings of why nation states came into being. Nation states are basically fairly new in terms of political organizations. And they became political organizations in order to homogenize a local form of colonialism. So when we look at Germany, when we look at France, when we look at Great Britain or England, we can see in the early stages of national development, the War of the Roses, things like that, we see this coalescing of power into the hands of a few in order to organize and control many. And that's the reason that nation states, developed. And nation states, sometimes we think about this. We think nation states are the colonial instigators. They're really not. Colonial states are basically tools in the hands of those who control the power. And that's something that's important for us to recognize, is that as political organizations, they're really only tools in the hands of those who have the capital of power. And so, as Aboriginal people, we've got to sort of live up to that and recognize that that's the reality. So where does that place us? Can we call ourselves nations? Well, that's difficult too, because our ancestors, when they lived indigenous lives and had responsible relationships with one another and with their neighbors and with the earth itself, did not consider themselves to be nations. They were cultural societies based upon an emerging relationship with the environments in which they lived. And their whole understanding of the world, of cosmology, of human relationships was based upon a very basic relationship of being of the earth, being made of the very soil and the very nutrients that the earth is made of, and pursuing those things in the best ways that their knowledge would provide, with all of the other creatures and substances within that same framework. And that defined governance, which emerged as sets of ethics out of those relationships. Now, can we return to that? Well, if we ever want to live sustainably on this earth again as a human race, as a species, we've got to give it a good try. And I think that's something where I'm really struggling with, because for most of my life, I spent a lot of time and a lot of effort in Aboriginal rights and working for Aboriginal rights, doing court cases. Our community took 3 cases before the Supreme Court. You know, we have fought struggle after struggle in order to protect our land and to protect our rights to that land. And what that has done is it's degraded our capacity to survive as a community. And I think that's true with a lot of Aboriginal communities who find themselves as the grist in the colonial struggle or the colonial nation-to-nation sort of process, is that we lose our will to live. We lose our will to hold on. And I've seen that happen to not only my own community, but I've seen it happen to a lot of other communities. Now, there's a couple of other things that I just wanted to highlight and I think are worth discussing in this. I've mentioned that this is a global issue. And we see this really around the globe. And so there's a couple of things that I've done in my research. I've tried to sort of measure who's winning the battle. And in reality, when you look at the progress of colonialism and the progress of those who hold colonial power, they're winning. The world is actually becoming more colonized now in terms of labor, in terms of environment, the use of the environment, the exploitation of the environment, and the degradation of indigenous relationships. And if you use those 3 categories to measure who's winning the battle, you can clearly see that the colonial powers are actually winning the battle. The other thing is that the process of using nation states as tools is also beginning to wane, because they have actually used, they've basically served the purpose that they needed to serve. And now in a globalized network, where transportation and communication are so much different than they were at the beginning of the 20th century, the whole game has changed. And we've got to recognize that as Aboriginal people, that's a matrix that we live in as well. And we see this happening across the world in many places. So that's a reality that as Aboriginal people we have to look at. The other thing is the rights issue. Having spent a lot of my life fighting for Aboriginal rights, I also began to recognize that we need to do that. We need to stand up for ourselves. We have to fight for those rights. But often when we fight for those rights, we place the state and the state politicians in the position of the Great White Hope, because they're better able than we are to control the narrative. And so when we look at murdered and missing women, who's in control of the narrative today? Not Aboriginal people. The families are being paraded as sort of specimens, sort of voyeuristic specimens, in a process where the government now has control to solve the problem. So once again, we've lost control of that narrative. And every time we engage in a fight for rights, the Great White Hope takes over the process. Whether they do anything about it, whether they bring down the cost of bottled water, you know, or solve the boiled water problems, that's no longer relevant. What's relevant is that they control the narrative, and they're in the position of being the ones who, the only ones who can solve the problem, and we give them that right. So I hate to be the stick in the mud, but basically I think what we have to think about is the communities that we belong to. What can we do to have a good relationship with the earth, with one another, and to build on that, and to let others see that people can take control of their food security and take control of their self-defense. You know, I guess I'll end with this in terms of self-defense. When I read the recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I thought, well, that's a lot of stuff. There really only needed to be one recommendation. And if Aboriginal people, with any self-confidence, had written that document, alone, without the Great White Hope looking over their shoulder, they would have basically only had one recommendation. And that is, if you take our children again, we will kill you.